I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see you folks, and for me, it's just I love talking about this subject because obviously I'm very passionate about the game industry, running the IGDA. For those of you who don't know what the IGDA is, we are the professional society for anyone who makes video games worldwide. We have over 130 chapters around the world. We have special interest groups for anything from production and writing and game design to AR, VR, and all kinds of other stuff. But our mission is really simple. We want game developers to get better at what they do. So we want them to advance their careers and enhance their lives and just get better at it. Some of our top priorities, we advocate on key issues. So like this year alone, we've been very vocal about the crunch issue, which we'll talk about a little bit more, about the gray market and how that affects indie developers, about diversity and inclusion in our industry, and on the list goes. Professional development and mentorship. We do mentorship cafes at different events. We encourage people to find a mentor and to talk to one another and basically get better at your craft, because ultimately that's really what we want to do. Also providing network and community. That's what the chapters and special interest groups are for. Of course, that's here. You've got the Dutch Game Guard, and you've got other groups here that have been great in fostering that sense of community, so you all come together, and including conferences like this. And of course, international awareness and cooperation too, because really we all are in this together as an industry. We are all, fighting the same battles, so to speak, in terms of getting the respect for our art form, for getting the resources we need from governments, for getting society to wake up and realize that we are a ubiquitous form of entertainment that doesn't have to be feared anymore. Now, my job as executive director is multivariate. I go speak a lot and make weird gestures when I do, and go to events, visit a lot of studios all around the world, emerging markets, game jams, things like that, and again, meeting with government officials quite frequently. This is back in Tunisia in January and February this year. And again, speaking a lot. You notice that, I'm cosplaying there because I am an avid cosplayer. And that's because my daughter there on the right is a costume designer, so we just have a great time together doing Comic-Con and all that. So I'm a total geek. A lot of people wonder, well, my background as a geographer and cartographer who's worked in the industry for over 20 years doing what I call culturalization work, like she must be really stuffy and academic. Like, no, I'm not. I'm really a dork. Because like when I go speak at events, like in Norway last year, I had to go visit where they film Hoth, of course. And when I was in Tunisia, you got to go visit Tatooine, right? I mean, that's what everyone does. For me, in terms of my history with the game industry, I started with Pong. That was my first game because I'm that old. And so for me and for my friends at the time, this thing showing up in the store was the same as this event, if you've seen 2001. It was a moment that changed our lives. We, as life forms, evolved into something that was then later called a gamer. And for us, ever since then, I've been a gamer all my life. Spent my days in high school in the arcades, Atari Star Wars, my favorite game, and so on and so on. So I love games. I've been around them all my life, and I'm a total geek. So that being said, when we talk a lot about the game industry, this term industry, if we want to just look at the definition, means diligence, from industrious meaning active. It's a good, solid, working term. We throw that term around a lot, industry, industry, industry. The game industry does this or does that. But we have to realize the industry is not this. It's not gears, it's not machine work, because when you talk about game industry, you think about like this huge locomotive sitting on a train track, but it isn't. It's people. Everyone in this room is part of that. We are all the industry. The industry is not a machine. It may be a process of development and a creative process, as well as a marketing process and distribution process, but it is ultimately people who are involved in this, because art comes from people. It doesn't come from machines. So we have to remember that. I love this T-shirt that one company had in Croatia back in April or in May at Reboot, where they said our #1 game is our people. And I thought, absolutely, that's exactly the right message. So the thing that we deal with as an industry, or as people working in this industry or working in this group, and I don't want to say that industry is a bad word. I just want to make sure that we understand that industry means people. It's comprised of us. And we're always dealing with this balance between showing our artistic freedom, because games are a viable art form, and also maximizing the revenue that we want to make off of those games. And this is a constant struggle for us. The film industry deals with this too. A lot of other creative art forms deal with this issue. I think we as an industry are still dealing with it at a less maybe mature level, because film has been around for over 100 years, where we've been around for a few decades. And this is always a struggle because we want, as artists and as game developers, we want to create what we want to create and be free to create what we want to create. But there's a lot of things that impede that, whether it's government regulations or ratings boards or things like that. And you want to make what you want to make. So if you want to make a game that is potentially offensive to a lot of people, from my perspective, I don't care. That's your freedom of speech. That's your ability to do so. But are you going to make money off it? Probably not. You might get some PR from it because people will vilify you and you'll get assaulted on Twitter. But other than that, you may not make money off it. And so most of the people I know working in this industry, they want to both express their art, but they also want to make a living off of it. And so we have to balance this, what I call the fulcrum of compromise, where we don't always get to make the artistic decisions we might really want to make because we know it's not going to be viable in the marketplace. And that's what makes games like film somewhat an interesting proposition, because it's an art form, but we also want to make money. And to make money, you have to appeal to a certain audience. And it's a whole complicated dynamic that we're dealing with. Now, one of the things I'm going to go through and I wanted to relate to you is some of the information from our developer satisfaction survey that we do every year in the IGDA. So we launched it a couple years ago. We used to do what we call a quality of life survey, but now we do the DSS. And we kind of update our demographics for the industry. Is we also ask developers about their opinions of their work, about their specific jobs, as well as how they see the industry and where they think the industry is going. So it's been really instrumental for us to understand a lot of facts about the industry strictly from a developer standpoint. A lot of trade associations like the ESA in the US or the BIU in Germany and a lot of the other ones, they will do similar surveys, but it's mainly focused on the consumer side. So like if you know the ESA in the US, right around E3 every year, they release this essential facts about the game industry, which is essentially demographics about the US consumer. So just to let you know, last year's DSS that we did, I'm not going to read through all this. You can just glance at it. This is just for reference. This is some of the demographics that came out of this. We are constantly trying to expand the reach of the survey, so we're always looking for partners to help send those links. We did have it localized into 7 languages last year. Sorry, not Dutch, though, but someday. In terms of gender diversity, so this is the way it broke down in our survey. So you can see there that it's still, pretty male-dominated. In terms of the number of women in the industry, 20% is roughly where it comes out to. That's what it was the previous year. The Develop survey that was done in the UK last year showed that it was 15% women in the industry. In Finland, it was 20%. So generally speaking, it's about that 15 to 20% range that we're seeing. In terms of ethnic diversity, unfortunately, it's even worse. This industry tends to be very Caucasian in nature. And again, this survey, keep in mind that about 50% of the survey was North America, and then the rest of it, was basically the rest of the world. Probably about 25% was Europe. So you are going to have a bit of a skew in terms of the ethnic representation. When we ask people reasons to want to join the game industry, I don't know how well you can see those up there, but you see those 2 big spikes: earn a living doing what I enjoy, and share my passion for games by working in the industry. So passion, huge amount of passion. That's why I want to join the game industry. We ask them, how long do you plan to remain in the game industry? Indefinitely. It's like everyone almost answers indefinitely. And these are signs of, again, I keep saying, games are an art form and that we are artists. This is the kind of thing you see from artists. If you ask painters or writers or filmmakers the same question, the same answers show up. It's like, this is what I do. It's not a matter of being a job. It's what I do. This is kind of what I exist for. And when we ask statements or questions like this, like what best describes your relationship with current employment, the number 1 answer, this is my career and a large part of my life. That top one being, this is my career and my life. I'm kind of glad that's not the top answer, because it's nice to have some balance in your life. Although for some people, that's what they choose to do. So game developers, we have a strong artistic passion that's very clear. That's like not really debatable. We have no plans to stop making games. It's kind of like we're just going to do that till we drop dead. It still tends to be a mostly male industry and mostly white as well at this point. Now, one of the things we also ask in the survey is we ask, what factors do you think contribute to the public's negative perception of the industry? So I thought this was really interesting that the number one answer was working conditions, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the other two high answers on there, sexism in the games themselves and sexism in the workforce. And now keep in mind, 70% of the respondents to this survey were male. So this isn't just women speaking up on this issue. This is a more universal issue that people are responding to. And so we asked the question, do you feel there's equal opportunity and treatment for all in the industry? A lot of people said no. They don't think that's the case right now. But when we asked them, do you think diversity in the workplace and diversity in the game industry is important? And a great majority said yes, it's either very important or somewhat important. So there seems to be a value that diversity is a good thing. It's just that we're not quite there yet, and there is a wider perception that there is not equal opportunity for everyone who enters this industry. Now in the US, if we use the US statistics, just because it was easier for me to compare, according to the ESA's Essential Facts doc they released last year, about 44% of game players are women. I know generally speaking it tends to be about 50-50 parity depending on the type of games you look at, but then only 20% of game developers are women. So it's an interesting dichotomy there, an interesting difference between those who are playing and those who are actually making games at this point. The more telling thing that's kind of scary is the wage gap that exists in the industry. And I have actually talked to several people who think this is a myth. They think there is no wage gap. But when we actually do empirical data studies on wages across the industry, there is an actual verified wage gap in this industry. And you can see there the average salary between men and women. And then the smallest gap tends to be for those in game design, but the largest gap is in those who are in audio. And if you haven't seen it, just recently there's the Game Sound Con, which is a game audio convention. If you can look it up on Google, they released a part of their own survey, which they did a wage salary just for audio people, and they released that just about a month ago, and they verified the fact that the audio disparity is huge in terms of the wage gap. So this is a problem as well. This is, again, not just a US issue. This is a more universal issue. It will vary, I just already said that. It will vary in some countries, of course, because some countries have different laws around labor issues and wages and all that kind of thing. Now, going back to this slide about negative factors that influence the public's perception. So I mentioned previously, sexism in the game, sexism in the workforce is pretty high. But here, to go back to this, working conditions is number one. Now, I would not expect the public to understand what the working conditions are. How would they have that kind of insight into the game industry? They don't really, I don't think there's a lot of articles in major media sources that talk about the working conditions in the game industry. So I kind of feel that this is maybe a lot of developers saying they wish the public knew what the working conditions were like. So they see it as a number one reason. So honestly, when we did the survey the first year, I expected the top answer, perceived link to violence, to be the number one answer, because that's what I still hear when I speak to a lot of people in the public, is they think that there's a linkage there, or the link to obesity. But no, it was working conditions. So when we asked developers reasons for wanting to leave the game industry, you can see there, found a better job, found a job with better pay and hours, I was burned out, or the top answer, I want a better quality of life. That's not a good sign. That's really not a good sign, especially you think about juxtaposing that answer with the answer that I want to make games indefinitely, and it's a huge part of my life. And so it's like something is wrong here. Now, when we look at the type of employment, so in the people who responded to the survey, about 70% said they're full-time permanent employees. We ask, well, how many employers have you had in the last 5 years? The average is 4. 4 full-time jobs in the last 5 years. That's, when we hear about the game industry going to a certain level of turmoil, that's what that represents right there, is a certain amount of churn that happens. Now, granted, the game industry, somewhat like film, is project-based, so you do have things where people will finish on a project and move on to another job, but still, having 4 full-time jobs in 5 years, it sounds pretty excessive. Now, the fiscal realities that came out of the survey as well, that 21% of the respondents make less than 13,000 euro a year. Now, that does tend to represent more people who are working on the indie side, so they're kind of scraping by getting their projects done. 30% receive no bonuses, 39% receive no incentives at all for working harder and all that kind of stuff, and 38% receive no compensation for being in crunch mode, which is that's a lot of people, more than a third of the industry saying that when I'm expected to work extra hours, I get nothing for it. I'm just expected to do it. Now, a lot of times, I hope everyone knows what this movie is, right? You don't know, this is Bridge on the River Kwai. It's about POWs captured in Japan in World War II. So if you don't know, maybe I'll use this image instead. Is this a little more relevant? Okay. So it makes me sad that people don't know that movie. That's why I use a different image. Anyway, a lot of times if you complain about the crunch issue or work-life balance and all that, a lot of times, I hear management say, well, you're lucky to work in the game industry. You're lucky to be in this position. Be happy in your work. And I use that phrase, be happy in your work, because in Bridge on the River Kwai, the Japanese general who ran the POW camp, that's what he kept telling the prisoners, just be happy in your work. So yeah, it's a joke. Anyway, we often hear that if you complain, it's like, well, sometimes managers will say, you know what, I can find 20 people to take your job. So if you don't like it, leave. Go ahead. And it is a certain level of exploitation that we've seen where management kind of leverages onto the passion that we have as developers because we want to work so bad. We want to work on these projects so bad. And that there's kind of a top-down expectation that you should be crunching. Now, crunch mode, as they call it in the game industry, usually outside the game industry, it's called poor project management. But for some reason, the game industry, it's taken on this veneer of being something glamorous or kind of a fraternal, like, hey, you remember the crunch of 2006? Yeah, we slept under our desk throughout Christmas and New Year's. Wasn't that awesome? It's like, no, it wasn't. But, it's kind of like we endured the battle together. But, frankly, it's bullshit. It really is, because that's just not the way people work. And there's been countless studies done. We actually released a white paper with the organization called TakeThis.org, which focuses on mental health in the game industry. We released this white paper about a month ago, and it focuses on the very real cost, both physically and mentally, that crunch time has on people. And there's been a lot of psychological studies that show that maybe for a couple weeks it's okay, but if you do it in a sustained amount, like for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, whatever, it really tears people apart, and they just cannot sustain that level of creativity and productivity. And when we ask developers, is it necessary? Is crunch necessary? The majority disagree that it's not necessary. And we ask, what are some of the key reasons? Poor, unrealistic scheduling is number one, and there's a lot of other reasons on there. Now, granted, I realize that crunch is not a universal thing. I know here in Europe it tends to be less prevalent, but it also depends whether or not you're like working in a studio environment versus doing your own stuff. Because I understand, I created my own business when I left Microsoft 11 years ago, and so I understand when you're an entrepreneur, the whole notion of there's crunch is just, well, that's just what I do because I'm trying to survive. I'm trying to pay my rent or pay my mortgage or whatever. So there's a certain reality to it, but what I'm mainly focusing on is more of a top-down when management says you will work 16 hours a day and you will work that for 3 months in order to help us get this done, or else you can leave. That's the kind of thing we're trying to highlight, because I think a lot of us understand that there's a certain level of crunch that we do ourselves, which I tend to call creative groove. So like we kind of get in this mode, or we're working with our teammates and we're just rolling on such a great idea that we don't want to stop, and oftentimes that really helps the game. And in a short time period, that's not a bad thing. You kind of get into that creative groove and really kind of sustain that for a little bit. But if you do that for weeks or months on end, it's just not going to end well. Fortunately, the answer is that crunch has been getting a bit less. So when we ask people how many weeks in a row do they crunch, so you can see here between 2004, 2009, and 2014, it's been decreasing. So there's fewer weeks per year, and the crunch periods themselves are actually shorter too. So it's getting a bit better. But where does this lead to? So when we ask the question, if unionization vote were held in your country today, how would you vote? And so 56% of people said they would vote for a union, which is really interesting. In 2009, it was only 33%. So you're getting a certain amount of tension going on there between the expectations on people and the reality of having to do their jobs on a day-to-day basis. And so when we ask people, if you want to be self-employed or freelance, what's the main reasons you would want to be that? Number one, more control over working conditions. The answer right there. And when we ask what kind of company or studio would you most prefer to work, it's indie. And I think, again, what's coming out of this is again, the kind of creative passion and the creative freedom that we as game developers have. We love working on some of the big franchises and all that kind of stuff because it gives us experience, but ultimately we really want to be doing our own vision and having control over that vision. So when we ask by name, what company would you most like to work for, Valve is always number one, but it's interesting, my own company is usually in the top 3 to 5 every single time, because that's ultimately, again, people want to do, set their own path. But yeah, Valve, Blizzard, BioWare, they're always in the top 5, never fails. And then we asked, what platforms are you considering over the next 5 years for growth? Steam, PC, and Android phone. Again, pretty much represents a more indie vision of this industry. You notice how consoles way down there at 6, and it keeps dropping. So independent game development really is becoming, it's a default method of game creation. I think it's far more widespread demographically and geographically than a lot of people realize. I mean, because when I go to all these emerging markets all over the place, it's everywhere. It's like everyone is developing games. It's amazing to see how much game development has become democratized in the last 5 years. A lot due because tools like Unreal and Unity and all those are free now. There's a lot of education you can find online, so if you don't have a game school locally, you can go on YouTube and learn how to use this stuff, and it's really accessible. Or people get involved with an IGDA chapter or SIG or something, and they just talk to people and they learn how to make these things. And so I do think indie games are really going to be the gateway through which people are going to accept games as an art form, because we're seeing so many cool things come from the indie space, amazing things. Like if you were here at Indigo yesterday, there's just amazing, beautiful games being made that you're not really seeing in the console world so much. And I do think having that closer connection between game creators and players is also something that's being unique too, although we all know that can be a double-edged sword. So I'm almost done here. So in your general opinion, we also ask about the importance of localized or regional versions of games, because as a lot of us realize that the world is, it's a global market. It's not just Western Europe. It's not just North America. And so a lot of people agree that it's really important to have localized and regional games. In the next several years, we're seeing double-digit growth in a lot of the emerging markets. And I can tell you most game developers I speak to are not thinking at all about these markets. They're just trying to get their game done, or they're trying to focus on, maybe they'll localize into 1 or 2 languages, but that's it. So the landscape of who's playing games is also going to shift dramatically over the next several years. So the future of this industry, in my view, is basically when the artistic value of games will no longer be an issue. Part of that is political, so part of it means we're going to have to wait another about 15 years until every politician on Earth will have grown up with video games. So it won't be an issue anymore. So we're just going to have to wait it out. We're going to keep fighting in the meantime, but honestly speaking, the real change is going to be demographic. So when we get that generational change, so that all the politicians actually, they're not going to legislate against stuff they grew up with and they loved, playing PlayStation or Xbox or whatever it is. Those who make games will better reflect those who play them. We're seeing that demographic shift as well, and there's a lot of effort being made to, help get more people of diversity into the game industry. And the games people play will be far more varied and diverse in type, in content, and origin. We're just going to keep seeing that trend, which is really exciting to me. And working conditions and demographics won't be a deterrent to a career, because still to this day, I still get people, I meet them where they say, I would love to work on games, but I don't want to work those hours. I don't want to work in that kind of condition, so I'm not going to do it. And we don't want to hear that anymore. And then finally, crunch is going to be rare. I think it should always be a choice, and it's always going to be compensated. So hopefully we're going to get to that point too. And we're starting to see that shift as well in a lot of companies, because frankly, a lot of the younger generation coming up, call them millennials or whatever you want to call them, a lot of them I'm finding are just like, they draw a line for themselves and say, you know what, I want to work and I'm passionate, but that's not going to be my entire life. There's a lot of other things I want to do. And having that kind of balance is really important. So think about what's your vision for the industry. That's my vision for the industry. That's where I see things going in the next few years based on all of my discussions and meetings and the work that I do. So it's really exciting to me. So I think we might have just a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah. Couple of questions, yeah. Questions from the audience for Kate? No one?
There's one here.
Ah, sorry. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if there are any programs for the diversity that you would like to see. Is what is actually being done to, to make it a more balanced industry?
So there's a few things going on. So one of the things that we're doing, there's a coalition of us that came together, frankly, in the wake of Gamergate. So in the wake of that, there's a top-down coalition that's involving a lot of major players in the industry, representatives from Microsoft, Sony, and a bunch of others. And we have regular meetings, and we're basically developing programs to make this a very concrete program. We're partnering with all kinds of groups like Girls Make Games and Girls Who Code and all these other programs, inner city programs that bring a lot of people of diversity into the industry. So we're trying to do a lot more and focusing on those areas. I mean, I don't know if you heard that like at E3, Microsoft launched their Gaming for Everyone initiative, which is also really exciting. So they're making a huge, substantial investment in trying to expand the role of game development just beyond the kind of normal demographic. So there's a lot going on. I think it's going to take time for it to kind of really reach the surface, but it's there. It's out there.
Okay, we have time for more questions whilst the next speaker is going to set up his laptop. Any questions? Okay.
I work in cultural education. I'm not necessarily a game maker, but I have always wondered why it is that if you want to become a guitar player, you can take lessons for that as a youngster or as a kid. And I wonder if there's any programs or any ways of get our young people to make games at a very early stage, because then it's also the time to engage the girls in the progress. I guess.
Yeah, well, that's some of the programs I mentioned actually target like very young, like elementary school, because what we've seen, like with women, it's like you see a huge amount of interest in elementary school in science and technology and math, but then you get to middle school and puberty and it just kind of disappears, or it goes, there's a lot of social issues there. And so we're trying to, elevate that and say, look, it is a viable career. It's something where you are actually welcome in this industry, and trying to bridge that gap. It's a key part of what this initiative I mentioned, what we're trying to do is figure out how do we make sure that pipeline is solid so that we're not losing people. So if they want to go into the gaming industry, they know there's a choice. Because I still meet a lot of young people where they don't even know that it's an option, especially people of diversity, whether it's women or people of color. They're just like, I didn't know that's something I can do. So we're trying to change that.
Okay, one final question.
Okay. Oh, you hold the mic. It's okay. So most of the developers here tend to end up in an independent career or as independent developers. Are there any statistics or facts or data that you see from the survey that specifically relates to indies that will be good to know if you're going to be an independent developer?
Well, I think, besides some of the stuff I shared, I think one of the things that I'm trying to remember, I have to dig it out of my memory, but the survey results are on the IGDA site too, if you want to go kind of dig through the summary report, because there's a lot of stuff in there. But I think one of the things too is kind of the reality factor in indie dev, which I think a lot of people understand, at least implicitly, is that success is not guaranteed. In fact, success is rare. And so having that contingency plan is really important. I think one of the things that we asked was about, like, what do you wish you knew? And of course, the answer is usually better business sense, better understanding of business, better understanding of taxes, HR issues, all of that kind of stuff, because most indies understand game dev, but it's all the other stuff that comes along with being an entrepreneur that is just not there. And that's usually pretty much the number one reason why a lot of them don't make it. Whether it's either the game isn't good, that's their issue, or they just don't have the marketing acumen to just understand how do I make my game known to the world, and that's really tough to do.
You stick around today?
Yes, I will be around.
Okay, so if you have any more questions, find us someplace here. Give her a round of applause, Kate Edwards.
All right, thank you. Thank you again.